Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we're going to talk about slave rebellions, the Stono Rebellion and Gabriel's Rebellion, to be specific. We're reading a book called Slave Rebellions by the Lucent Library of Black History. It was published in 2007, and the primary author is Jessica A. Gresco. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll be back.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Introduction. Slaveholders' worst nightmare. Fear had kept one Virginia resident and his wife awake at night for 3 months when the man wrote to a friend in 1831. He confessed that he and his wife were terrified to go to bed, quoting, "Our nights are sometimes spent listening to noises." The man's alarm was understandable. That year, a slave named Nat Turner had led a bold slave rebellion near the man's home. Beginning with a nighttime attack, the brazen rebels killed more than 50 people before being stopped by the militia, and the act has shocked white citizens. I don't know why they were shocked. The people were enslaved and being treated poorly. Of course they resisted. Every man wants freedom. The letter writer said he was not the only one who was shaken. There has been and there still is a panic in all this country, he wrote. In fact, that fear, those they held as property might rise in rebellion, was widespread among those white slaveholders from colonial times to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. From the first time slaves were brought to the United States until slavery was abolished after the Civil War, rebellion was an ever-present threat, especially in the South, where slavery was an integral part of life and where most of the slaves in the country were held. Fears of rebellion ran high. Though authorities created strict laws and harsh punishments for slaves who gathered together, these attempts to prevent slaves from plotting uprisings were never completely effective. Slaves still found ways to plan and carry out rebellions. Indeed, slave rebellions were fairly common. According to one historian's account, there were over 250 documented slave uprisings in America in which 10 or more slaves participated. The number of rebellions swells to several hundred when smaller plots, those involving 3 or more slaves, are counted. Severe punishments and even the threat of death would not stop slaves determined to strike out at their oppressors, and the names of rebel leaders like Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, and Sneak became the stuffs of legends. Individual rebellions differed from each other in striking ways. For example, some rebels targeted whites living in large communities, while others planned rampages through the countryside. Some rebels planned it for years, waiting for the right moment, while others acted more spontaneously. The outcomes of slave rebellions varied as well. Some uprisings achieved their leaders' goals of causing death and destruction. Others failed utterly or were discovered before they began, or uh, they were found out, and one of the slaves that was a part of it told on them and got manumitted for telling on the slave rebellion. Whatever their outcome, slave rebellions all thoroughly unnerved white people throughout the states where slavery was allowed. Night after night, slave owners and their families went to bed with at least some sense that they were at risk, that something in the slave quarters, someone might be waiting for the opportunity to rise up and strike a deadly blow for freedom. So, as you can see, what consistently happened time after time after time is that they try to hide this history of rebellions from us so that they'll be able to project that image of a docile slave on us. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Slavery and slave rebellions in America. Slave rebellions were a powerful and frightening reality in America from 1619, when the first slaves were brought to the British colonies, up to the close of the Civil War in 1865, when slavery in America was finally outlawed. What we know about slavery being outlawed is that slavery is outlawed except for that 13th Amendment clause, which says that if you go to prison or become a criminal, then they can enslave you. These rebellions often came as a shock to the slave owners and other white citizens, but slaves never stopped longing for a way out of the harsh and often brutal conditions imposed on them. It is not surprising that many looked for any opportunity to rebel. So we were not just picking cotton and singing songs and taking care of Master's baby, nursing babies. We were plotting and planning the whole time to get free. Slavery comes to America. The story of American slavery begins during colonial times. Colonists came from England to settle the newly discovered North American lands in the late 16th century. They built homes and carved farms from the wilderness, but the colonists found they needed more laborers to tend to their crops. At first, much of this work was done by indentured servants. Most indentured servants were poor men and women, white, who came from England. They promised to work for a specified period of time, usually 7 years, in exchange for payment of their transatlantic passage. Once finished with their indenture, they were free to start new lives in the colonies. I'll add to this that oftentimes there was money that they got. Some of them got land. So these people were white people that were landed, and that were given benefits for coming to the New World to work somebody else's farm for a while. And it was an opportunity for them to get a fresh start. And some Black equals African people that came here got a similar deal in the very beginning until they got greedy. Continuing. After a while, the flow of indentured servants slowed. Economic conditions in England improved, and fewer people needed or were willing to become indentured servants. At this point, colonists began to look to Africa for laborers. Africa, after all, already had an established slave trade, and Europeans tapped into this market. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders listening with you. I'm so happy that you're here. Thanks for tuning in. The forecast says the earliest documented slave rebellion was 1526 or something like that, way before 1619, which is when they tell us slavery started in the colonies. Eventually, a system called the Triangle Trade developed. Slave traders would sail from Europe to Africa with a cargo of textiles, rum, and firearms. They traded these consumable goods for slaves. Slaves would then be taken to the New World, usually the Caribbean, where they would be sold or traded for goods like sugar, tobacco, and cotton, more consumable goods. When traders sailed back to Europe, sold these goods, and purchased items for trading in Africa, and the cycle began again. The trade was enormous, and historians estimate that between 12 and 20 million Africans were taken from their homes and brought to the New World in this manner. Taken. The African men and women who were sent in chains to the New World became enslaved in numerous ways. Tribal warfare provided one avenue for traders to obtain slaves. Victorious tribes sold prisoners captured during wars in exchange for fabric, rum, and other goods. Slave traders encouraged these wars because they brought more captives. Another way traders obtained slaves was through raids carried out by both African and European men. During a raid, the men would burn a whole village and capture the fleeing villagers. Some Africans were sold into slavery as punishment for a crime. Other slaves were kidnapped either while they were working in the fields or simply walking alone near their village. Sanique, a slave who headed the rebellion aboard the ship Amistad in 1839, explained that he had been taken in this way. A rice farmer with a wife and 3 children, Sanique had owed money to an acquaintance. When Sanique was unable to repay the loan, the man had him kidnapped and sold to a slave trader. The money the man received for Sanique settled the debt. Once taken from their villages, slaves were sold to a trader. These unscrupulous merchants maintained forts along Africa's coast, where the slaves were housed before they were resold to other slave traders from many countries, including America, Spain, and Portugal. These slave traders inspected the slaves and chose the individuals who looked the strongest and healthiest to judge their fitness. Traders poked and prodded slaves. Sometimes the traders had the slaves open their mouths and other parts to inspect their teeth, or had them jump up and down when the buyer and seller haggled over prices. The middle passage and sale. Being captured and sold was only the beginning of the slave's ordeal. Once sold, slaves were loaded onto ships for the journey to the New World. During the 2 months or more it took to cross the Atlantic Ocean, slaves endured horrific conditions for most of the journey. Several hundred slaves were packed together and chained to the ship's dark, hot hold with little or no room to move and little fresh air. The hold reeked of human waste. If they were lucky, sometimes the ship's captain would allow the slaves to exercise on the ship's deck. Disease spread rapidly under these conditions, and many captives died on the journey. Severe diarrhea and scurvy were common diseases and causes of death, as were outbreaks of smallpox and measles. The slaves who died were simply thrown overboard, and they say that sharks would follow the slave ships, and that we changed the slave trade itself changed the patterns that sharks swarm in because they were following the ships to eat the flesh of the dead slaves that were being thrown overboard. And to this very day, those animals follow that path. Some slaves were desperate to get out of the miserable conditions aboard the slave ships. They tried to commit suicide by jumping overboard while on deck. Others refused to eat or were too sick to do so. Knowing that a dead slave was a lost investment, slave traders whipped those who refused to eat or forced fed them. Once across the Atlantic Ocean, slave ships docked at a number of ports in North America or the Caribbean. Their human cargo was then sold to slave markets or at auctions. One trader described an auction he witnessed in Richmond, Virginia in 1861 this way. So in 1861, they were still trading slaves heavily. At length, a little bustle occurred at the back of the room, and a fine-looking colored man was brought forward. He walked straight up to the block, mounted it, and put himself in the most dignified attitude. Some of the buyers stopped him during his walk and asked him a variety of questions as to last employment, state of his health, and so forth. Then they turned his head to the light and lifted the corners of his eyes to ascertain whether or not they were free from indicators of disease. In the same way, they examined his teeth. Slaves from Africa and those born in the colonies to slave parents were sold in the same manner. Children born to slaves in the colonies also became slaves, and masters, owners, could sell their slave property at any time. Slave families feared being split apart in this cruel fashion. Now, remember, if you read white scholars, they'll tell you that less than 36% of slave families were disrupted in this way. But we know that that number is much higher because they were breeding us like animals. And as soon as women were having babies, they were selling them away. So this family breakup and disruption happened a lot more common and was a lot more frequent than they document. Life as a slave. Whether they came from Africa or were born in the New World, slaves were destined to spend their lives working for an owner who dictated how they used almost every waking moment of their time. Farmers owned most of the slaves in the colonies. Slaves worked on cotton, indigo, rice, sugarcane, and tobacco farms. Some of these plantations were large and had over 100 slaves. Most plantations were smaller with 20 or fewer slaves. Some slaves worked as domestic servants, cooking and cleaning for their owners and taking care of their children. Most slaves did back-breaking work in the field, planting and then bringing in the crops. Regardless of where they worked, slaves had exhausting jobs. I'll also add there was this thing called urban slavery, where if you were an artisan or you had a special skill like a blacksmith or a shoemaker or even tailors and dressmakers or sometimes cooks, you could hire yourself out to other people so that your skill could be commoditized by you, but you had to pay your owner money to do that work. And sometimes you got to keep part of your profit, and sometimes you didn't. You had to pay for your place to live. You had to pay for your own food because you had this skill, and you had no opportunity to get free. You would get a pass. It was a work pass to go from place to place to do your skill. Even in the slave narrative of Noah Davis that we read here years ago, he talks about how he had a pass to go preach so that he could earn enough money to obtain his freedom. So they believed in giving out work passes and permits to some slaves as well. Many also lived in daily fear of their master's wrath. Slaves could be severely punished for even the smallest missteps. Overfilling a teacup could be a cause for a whipping. Years after she was freed, Sarah Ross described the way she and other slaves were punished at the plantations where she lived in Benton County, Mississippi. Frequently, the thighs of the male slaves were gnashed, and a saw and salt was put in the wound as a means of punishment for some misdemeanor. She remembered. The female slaves often had their hair cut off, especially those who had long, beautiful hair. So this was about control, and this was about degrading you in any way possible. The forecast says he thinks that Gabriel Prosser was paid and hired himself out as a slave. On large plantations, overseers, who could have been black but were almost always white, in the fields monitored slaves while they worked. Like the plantation owner, these men were entitled to punish slaves who disrespected them. They were as tough or tougher than the owners, whipping slaves if they did not work fast enough or hard enough. There were overseers and there were drivers on plantations. Overseers had the right to punish you, and drivers had the right to help you, to drive you, to whip you, to make you work harder and work faster. Drivers were almost always some other black enslaved person. They would use us to punish us, to create an environment where unity would not happen. Finally, the slaves' day was not finished when they were through with the master's work. Slaves often returned to their quarters and worked a small plot of their own land and cooked and cleaned for their own families. Because they were not required to give us nutritionally healthy food, they were only required to give us a certain amount of cornmeal and a certain amount of salt, pork, or fish. Then we had to supplement our diets. And some owners did not allow us to grow those gardens, but many owners did because it kept you healthy. Forms of rebellion. Under such harsh conditions, it is not surprising that many slaves harbored deep anger towards their masters and dreamed of escape. But harsh punishments awaited runaways who were caught and slaves who dared to openly defy their masters. As a result, slaves rebelled in many ways, some subtle, others much less so. Historian Herbert Aptheker has explained sabotage, shamming illness, stealing, suicide, and self mutilation and strikes were the devices which plagued slaveholders. The carelessness and deliberate destructiveness of the slaves, resulting in broken fences, spoiled tools, and neglected animals, were common. John Henry's here. Hi, John Henry. Thanks for tuning in. He says white folks' mentality is exactly the same today in relation to Black people. And you're right, it absolutely is. These acts of rebellion undoubtedly angered slave owners who were both angered and frightened by reports of arson, poisoning, and murder. So again, we resisted. We burned their stuff up, we poisoned them and their animals, and we killed them. Many of these rebellious acts, however, involved only one slave whose anger toward a master boiled over in violence. Organized, wide-scale rebellion, planned and carried out by slaves, generated a whole new category of fear. Whites were terrified of this form of rebellion, and whites are still terrified of this form of rebellion. That's why when we start moving as organized units, they get scared. The greatest threat to white supremacy is still to this day Black unity. Mass uprisings. The earliest recorded slave rebellion that they document in this book dates back to America in 1663. That uprising took place in Gloucester County in the colony of Virginia. It involved both indentured white servants and Black slaves. The plot, however, was discovered before it could be carried out, and those who had planned it paid with their lives. The bloody heads of several of the conspirators were hung from the area chimneys to warn any others who might harbor thoughts of rebellion. The man who had betrayed the plot was granted his freedom and 5,000 pounds of tobacco as his reward. So that was that manumission, meritorious manumission. So they meritoriously manumitted the person who turned his back on his fellow enslaved people, and they gave him 5,000 pounds of tobacco and his freedom. For the next 200 years, it's rumored that rebellions were a constant reality for slaveholders. Like the Gloucester County Slave Rebellion, some uprisings were planned by whites who disagreed with slavery or who sympathized with slaves. Most, however, involved only slaves or occasionally free Blacks who sought to aid those who were enslaved. A note about free Blacks: they are always trying to remove free Blacks from enslaved Blacks. They are always trying to remove economically mobile and upward Black people away from the lower class Black people. We have a class challenge in our community, but we need to be aligned against this white oppressor, because at the end of the day, they don't see the dollars you have in your pocket or your bank account. They see the skin you have on your body each and every day. Forecast says it was a white dude that snitched, Birkenhead or whatever his name was. Thank you, Forecast. Rebellion records. Historical accounts of slave rebellions are often unreliable. Records of trials and investigations have disappeared over the years. Sometimes a few records of an uprising were kept at all. Accounts were often printed in contemporary newspapers, but many of these were wildly inaccurate. In many cases, local officials made a point of suppressing the facts after a plot was discovered or after a rebellion actually took place. They reasoned, this was their reasoning, they reasoned that if other slaves learned about what happened, they might be encouraged to stage similar uprisings. For all these reasons, details of an uprising could be hard to come by. In 1800, Vice President Thomas Jefferson expressed his frustration in getting news about Gabriel's rebellion plot. Writing to his friend James Monroe, the governor of Virginia, where the rebellion plot had been uncovered, Jefferson said he was sorry he had not seen Monroe, quoting, "I wish to learn something of the excitements, the expectations, and extent of this Negro conspiracy, not being satisfied with the popular reports," end quote. John Henry says England had to rid itself of criminals which were the byproduct of capitalism and the beginnings of industrialization. The worst in the world were sent to North America and Australia. Yes, they were. Even when the facts about an uprising or plot were known, written accounts of the incidents were still often wrong. Residents and newspaper editors heard rumors and repeated them as truths in letters and newspaper articles. The problem was compounded in locations as far away from the rebellion site. Far-flung newspapers that wanted to print news of an uprising relied on reports from travelers or correspondents whose information was not always reliable. Sometimes these reporters made assumptions that they passed along as facts. Many of them received their information secondhand, meaning that news was delayed and often distorted. This was the case after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Rumors that Nat Turner was dead and that the rebels outnumbered more than 1,000 proved to be untrue. Thomas R. Gray, a lawyer who wrote the fullest account of the rebellion, had heard so much misinformation being repeated as fact that he began his report by saying, "The late insurrection in Southampton has greatly excited the public mind and led to 1,000 idle, exaggerated, and mischievous reports." Sorting fact from fiction was one of the reasons why he was writing, he said. John Henry says, the southeast coast of the U.S. is much like the west coast of Africa. The Europeans could not simply work the land. The Europeans could not penetrate the great dismal swamp until 100 years ago, which is modern time. Black people and Indians lived in that swamp together. Sunday uprisings. Despite the exaggerations and sketchiness in the account of slave rebellions, historians have enough information to note some similarities between uprisings. For example, slaves planning large-scale rebellions often chose the weekend to carry out their plot. On weekends, slaves were allowed a small amount of free time. It was therefore easier for conspirators to leave the plantation without raising suspicions. Second, many of the men who planned rebellions had advantages and freedoms rarely granted to slaves. For example, some rebel leaders could read, a skill that slaves were usually prohibited from learning. Reading gave them additional access to information and likely a status above their peers. Many of the men who became rebel leaders were permitted to move about freely. Often their masters had allowed them to hire out, working for others. One rebel leader, Denmark Vesey, was actually a free black man. So Denmark Vesey was a free black man. Once rebellion began, it usually proceeded slowly. The rebels were usually on foot, traveling through the countryside that featured a few roads, but many rivers that were bridged in only a few places. Under such circumstances, it would be many hours before other plantations were alerted that anything out of the ordinary was underway. Finally, one common feature of almost all major slave rebellions is what happened in the aftermath of the rebellion or after the plot was discovered. Almost all, without fail, The fear that the uprisings generated resulted in a wave of legislation that imposed new restrictions on Blacks or mandated increased white policing of the slave population. For example, after the Stonewall Uprising in 1739, South Carolina slaves were prohibited from carrying weapons and traveling in groups larger than 7 without a white escort. A similar tightening of restrictions happened in 1822 after Denmark Vesey's uprising in Charleston. A new group of 150 guards was established to patrol the city around the clock, and authorities imposed new taxes on free Blacks like Denmark Vesey, hoping to drive them out of the city altogether. An end to slavery. By the 1840s, slavery in the United States had become an all-consuming issue. The North and South were increasingly divided over a variety of issues. Northern states had enacted gradual emancipation laws, and both Black and white abolitionists were calling for an end to slavery. The system was no longer sustainable or morally correct, they said. Despite the best efforts of the abolitionists and others opposed to slavery, Southern states resisted any change. Slave owners' reaction to rebellion, meanwhile, showed just how determined they were to hold on to their way of life. Eventually, the issues tearing at the nation became too much. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. Other Southern states followed and formed the Confederate States of America. President Lincoln refused to accept the South's secession, vowing to use force to preserve the Union if necessary. On April 12, 1861, the North and South went to war. Over the next 4 years, the North and South engaged in the bloodiest conflict in American history. More than 600,000 Americans died in the war that ravaged the country. Ultimately, the South surrendered. Though the war was not solely about slavery, the bloody conflict ended the debate in the United States. All former Confederate states were forced to ratify the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery, except for criminals. The dreams of the leaders of slave rebellions, indeed all slaves, had finally at last been fulfilled. John Henry says Black people were master farmers, period, especially up until the Civil War, after white people learned this advanced farming from Black people. Up until the end of the Civil War, Black people, or slaves, were the most skilled workforce on the planet. Absolutely, we were skilled. The forecast says on Sundays, whites were at church. That was the best time for the rebellion until they passed a law requiring at least one armed white person during Black church or any gathering. And now, the Stonewall Rebellion. On Sunday, September 9th, 1739, a group of about 20 slaves gathered near the Stonewall Bridge, several miles southeast of Charleston in the English colony known as South Carolina. They were about to begin an uprising that would become notorious as the largest slave rebellion in the history of the colonies at that time. The rebellion would put complacent white colonists on notice. Henceforth, they would have to be wary of the people they considered their property. Tensions in the New World. The Stonewall Rebellion had its roots not just in the slaves' yearning for liberty, but in tensions between the colonial power in the New World. At the time, the 13 American colonies were firmly controlled by Great Britain, although other European powers had also established themselves in Northern America. France held much of what is today Canada, while Spain claimed Florida as well as a substantial portion of what would become the southwestern United States. Spain, France, and Great Britain did not coexist peacefully. In Europe, the three powers fought wars that spilled over to their North American colonies. As one way of harassing the British, the Spanish encouraged slaves to create trouble for their British masters, recognizing the importance of slave labor in the southern colonies. The Spanish did what they could to deprive Britain's colonists of that labor because they allowed us to come flee to their colonies. They armed us, they provided weapons and equipment. They did some things, but it wasn't because they liked us. It was because they were fighting an adversary. In a royal decree on October of 1733, Spain announced that all slaves who fled their masters would be free upon reaching Florida. John Henry said, most would have been lower class whites and newly arrived Catholic Irish from the potato famine. Yes. Black enslaved grew all the food for themselves and for whites. White folks would have starved to death otherwise. Absolutely, they would have starved to death. So you see, these Spanish people did not like us. They were just fighting Britain by helping the enslaved people. So we talk about them as if they are our friends, but they are not our friends. It was just that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It was a strategic partnership for a period of time, but they are not our friends. To Florida. Spain's bold offer of freedom was most tempting to slaves living in Georgia, South Carolina, the colonies closest to Florida. Some slaves took the Spanish up on their offer of refuge in Florida and fled alone or with one or two companions. Two slave escapes in 1738 were particularly memorable. In one incident that year, South Carolina slaves passing through Georgia en route to Florida killed several Georgia residents. They were running to freedom and they killed several Georgia residents. Then, in November of 1738, a band of more than 20 escaped slaves from the colonies arrived in Florida together. The Spanish saw the group's arrival as the perfect opportunity to taunt the British. Spain's government again announced that the Spanish would welcome any slaves who fled to Florida. The problems posed by resistive slaves only worsened for colonists in 1739. In February, there was news that a group of South Carolina slaves had planned to rise up and escape to Florida. None of these rebellions, however, prepared South Carolinians for the Stono Uprising later that year. Timing and the Stono Rebellion. There is no record of who all the participants in the Stono Rebellion were or how long the rebels spent making their plans. Historians also still debate why the Stono rebels chose to begin their insurrection on Sunday, September 9th, 1739. The decision was probably based on a number of factors. One likely consideration was that the hostilities between Spain and Great Britain finally erupted in September and October, resulting in Great Britain declaring war on Spain. According to the historian Peter H. Wood, the news that war had broken out probably reached the Stono area the exact weekend before the uprising began. The news of war alone could have easily triggered a rebellion. Another factor the rebellious slaves may have weighed was a new South Carolina law called the Security Act. It required all white men to carry a gun to church on Sunday. Whites had long been uneasy about slaves' free hours at the end of the week when their owners were busy at church. It was one of the few times that slaves were free to gather, and whites were therefore recognized it as a time they were vulnerable to attacks. Beginning in the 1720s, South Carolinians wrote several laws requiring whites to be armed on Sundays. These laws were not well enforced, however, so the Stricter Security Act was written. It was scheduled to go into effect on September 29th, 1739. By rebelling before the law took effect, the slaves may have hoped to attack the planters while many were still unarmed. Other considerations may have also affected the timing of the insurrection. An epidemic of yellow fever had recently hit Charleston and its surrounding area. The epidemic threw the region into confusion. More than half a dozen Charleston residents were dying each day, and the outbreak was so fierce that much of the city was brought to a halt. The lieutenant governor postponed the meeting of the colonial legislature for more than a month. A school for young ladies was shut down. Even the city newspaper, the Gazette, stopped printing when its printer fell ill. With many whites sick or dying of this dreaded disease, slaves may have believed it would be easier to revolt. Liberty. Whatever their reasons, the rebels chose that morning of September 9th to begin their attack. After gathering at the Stono Bridge, less than 20 miles from Charleston, the rebel band barged into the nearby store and murdered the two men inside, beheading them and setting their heads on the stairs leading up to the building's second floor. Then they ransacked the building, arming themselves with guns and gunpowder, and set out on a road called the Ponpons. The road wound from South Carolina through Georgia and on to the port of St. Augustine in Florida. The route totaled more than 250 miles. As the group marched, they called for others to join them and continued their rampage, plundering and killing as they went. Somehow they obtained two drums, a flag, and as they marched, they shouted the word liberty. Along the way, the rebels torched homes and stole arms and sometimes liquor. The rebels did not destroy everything in their path, however. Coming to a tavern, the rebels announced that they would not hurt the tavern's owner because he was known to be kind to his slaves. In another instance, a slave hid his master while he convinced the group to leave the man unharmed. Still, a few hours later, after the death toll from the rebel army's rampage had grown to more than 20, the revolt looked like it might succeed, but a fateful encounter waited for the rebels down the road. South Carolina's Lieutenant Governor William Bull and a group of men were returning from the colony's Granville County and riding along the same road as the rebels. At about 11 o'clock that morning, Bull caught sight of the escaped slaves. He immediately realized that the countryside was in the middle of an insurrection. He knew he needed to call for help fast. Fleeing on horseback with his companions, Bull narrowly escaped capture and alerted the militia. Meanwhile, the rebels continued their destruction. By afternoon, the rebel brigade had swelled to between 60 and 100 members. Flushed with their success, the group stopped in a field and set to dancing, singing, and beating drums to draw more Negroes to them, according to one report. The rebels had traveled 10 miles from the Stono Bridge. They would not get much farther. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the militia arrived at the field where the slaves were gathered. 100 armed men confronted the rebels, and a battle ensued. A number of rebels died on the battlefield. Still others escaped to the woods. According to later reports, the Negroes were soon routed. Though they behaved boldly, many ran back to their plantations, thinking they had not been missed, but they were taken and shot. Even scattered, the rebels remained dangerous. At least 30 had escaped from the battlefield in small groups. Another 30 were thought to have escaped alone. White citizens feared that the rebels would regroup and renew their destructive march. The forecast says he was nice to his slaves, and we still haven't learned about these white people. We still haven't learned that none of them are our friends. As a result, all South Carolina went on alert. Guards patrolled river crossings and roads. Georgia officials were warned, too, since any rebels still heading for St. Augustine would have had to pass through that colony before reaching the Spanish territory of Florida. In response, Georgia Governor, who was General James Oglethorpe, dispatched patrols to search for the slaves. He also announced rewards for anyone who caught one of the conspirators. Finally, Oglethorpe called on some allies among the area's Native Americans, asking them to help pursue the rebel slaves. You hear that? The Native Americans were not our friends. We are told this over and over and over again, but the Native Americans are not necessarily our friends. We lived among them in the swamps, but when this white man comes into play, they are on the side of white people because they were the ones that hunted us down. The rebels caught. Within days, the patrols and militia had some success. According to a letter printed in the Boston Weekly Newsletter, after 2 days, the militia managed to kill about 20 more rebels and capture another 40. Some rebels were beheaded and their heads set up on posts alongside the road, a warning to other slaves of the consequences of rebellion. So they were trying to terrorize us. According to the Boston newspaper, other rebels were shot, some hanged, and some were gibbeted alive, meaning they were hung in chains and left to starve. Their bodies left hanging even after death. It took another week, however, for the militia company to catch up with and defeat the largest group of rebels. By that time, the group had managed to march another 30 miles, so they've traveled a total of 40 miles. But remember, Florida is 250 miles away. Another month passed before the newsletter finally reported the rebellion over. The rebellious Negroes were quite stopped from doing any further mischief, many of them having been put to the most cruel death, the newsletter reported. In November, a South Carolina Assembly Committee recommended that 10 Indians who had assisted in the hunting for and taking and destroying of rebellious Negroes should be rewarded. They were to be given a coat, a flap, a hat, a pair of Indian stockings, a gun, 2 pounds of gunpowder, and 8 pounds of bullets. The insurrection seemed to be over. Still, since some of the uprising's participants were not captured for another 6 months, one rebel ringleader, whose name was not recorded, eluded capture for 3 years before being caught and hanged. Fear in South Carolina. Even with most of the rebels killed or taken prisoner, the fear generated by the slaves' rampage remained strong. A number of farmers near the rebellion route packed up their belongings and families and moved into town. It was safer living close to their neighbors, they reasoned. The number of moves troubled Andrew Leslie, the minister of St. Paul's Parish, Catholic, where the rebellion began. He worried that if more families left the area, he would no longer have anyone to preach to. So he was worried not about their safety, not about the slaves. He didn't see the injustice in that, but he was worried about who was going to support him because he needed somebody to preach to. He says, "I shall have but a small congregation at church," he wrote in one letter. Leslie's parishioners were not the only ones who were nervous. A later report summed up the terror the plot had roused. Everyone that had any relation, any tie of nature, everyone that had a life to lose were in the most sensible manner shocked at such danger daily hanging over their heads. With residents fearing another attack, colony officials moved swiftly to prevent future uprisings. In the short term, a special guard was created to patrol the Stono River. Meanwhile, the South Carolina Colonial Assembly prepared to tighten the planters' control over their slaves. A new slave code. Perhaps the greatest changes that resulted from the Stono Rebellion were new restrictions governing South Carolina's slaves. South Carolina's first slave code, or body of laws governing slaves, had been written in 1696. The code included provisions aimed at preventing crimes by slaves. It also outlined how truant slaves should be tried. After the Stono Rebellion, the colony's legislatures set about writing a new, more stringent slave code. The new provisions became law in May of 1740, called an Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes and Other Slaves. The law's stated purpose was to prevent owners from treating their slaves badly. The colonial legislators reasoned that slaves who were mistreated were more likely to rebel. For this reason, the code prohibited owners from working slaves more than 14 or 15 hours a day. Further, owners who forced their slaves to work on Sunday could be fined. Finally, if slave owners refused to give their slaves sufficient food or clothing, a complaint could be filed with authorities on behalf of the slaves. But remember, a slave could not file that complaint themselves. And remember, they had gotten to the point where they thought that if they codified our existence, if they made slavery a little more comfortable, that we wouldn't rebel, that we wouldn't hunger for liberty and justice. Despite such seemingly generous provisions, the new legislation's aim was to really tighten restrictions on slaves themselves. The law prohibited slaves from assembling in groups, buying liquor, or carrying a gun without their owner's permission. No group of more than 7 slaves was allowed to travel from one location to another, unless a white person accompanied them. Any white person who spotted such a group traveling unaccompanied was authorized to apprehend all and every such slave, and may whip them not exceeding 20 lashes on the bare back. So if you and 6 of your friends got together and a white man caught you, then he could whip you and give you 20 lashes to the back, to the bare back. The act also set out a series of fines, punishments, and rewards designed to keep whites in control of their slaves. Any white person who taught a slave to read, for example, faced a fine of 100 pounds. Any slave who assaulted a white person could be killed, and anyone who apprehended fugitive slaves fleeing to Spanish territory would be rewarded with a bounty of between 5 and 100 pounds, depending on the gender and age of the runaways, where they were captured, and if they were taken dead or alive. The law also mentioned the Stono Rebellion specifically, exonerating any white militiamen or citizens who had killed slaves during the rebellion, because even then they probably wanted to sue for damage to property. The killings were justified in the name of preserving safety. Not all the provisions of the slave code were ever enforced, but that they were enacted attests to the fear that the uprising evoked among the colonists. Restrictions mount. The legislature did not stop with enacting a tougher slave code. The colonial lawmakers also strengthened the South Carolina Patrol Act in 1740, the same year that the new slave code was passed. Patrols were one way slave owners made sure their slaves were not plotting against them. On weekly rounds, patrol members watched for runaways and slaves acting suspiciously. Patrol members could stop and question slaves, search slave quarters, and punish slaves with whippings. When legislatures also enacted the number of people who were required to do patrol duty, the new law divided up districts into smaller beats that were easier to patrol and imposed fines on whites who neglected their patrol duty. Remember, all white men between the ages of 18 and 45 had to serve patrol duty. The lawmakers hoped that more and more thorough patrols would make it more difficult for slaves to plan another uprising. These tougher provisions clearly were written with the Stono Rebellion in mind. Certainly, if a patrol had caught the rebels when they first assembled at the bridge, they never would have begun the murderous rampage. In the wake of the Stono Rebellion, the Assembly also attempted to limit the number of slaves imported into South Carolina from outside of North America, because these Africans was about that life. Planters believed that newly imported slaves, remembering the freedom that they had lost, were more likely to rebel than those who had grown up in the colony. In fact, there is some evidence that the leaders of the Stono Rebellion were born in Africa. In an effort to decrease the number of foreign-born slaves, the legislature imposed high taxes on anyone who brought slaves in from outside the colony. From the new slave code to the new Slave Patrol Act, the Stono Rebellion changed slavery in the South. Masters became increasingly concerned about what keeping slaves meant in terms of their personal safety. They recognized that the potential for rebellion existed every single day. One man, looking back at the Stono uprisings, wrote that now the inhabitants cannot live without perpetually guarding their own safety. So what do you guys think? We're going to read Gabriel's Rebellion tomorrow. It's been an hour. I don't want to hold you guys that long. What do you guys think? I think that they try to hide this history of rebellion from us in an attempt to keep us thinking that we're docile and that we should accept the conditions as they are. I think that they don't see the wrong in slavery. I know that the people writing those laws in South Carolina didn't see a problem with slavery and enslavement. They felt that they were right. They felt that they had every right to enslave people, and they wanted to separate the free blacks from the enslaved blacks. They wanted to they wanted to continue to perpetuate their system of slavery and their way of life. They wanted to continue that. Greetings, Forecast. How are you this evening?
Hey, what's up, Mason? How you doing?
I'm doing good.
Yeah, yo, this is my lane. I love
I
this.
know this your bag. I know.
Yeah, I talk about this all day. But no, yo, I love this thing. Like me, I try to go on an order because I think if you go on an order, you can see how it really unfolded. Like when they passed what laws and like specifically, like instead of. But like I think like even with the Stonewall Rebellion, he was like they was from Africa. Apparently, I think this was the one where they was from a specific tribe or something, and allegedly they was selling slaves, but then they got kidnapped themselves, and they was supposed to be like the nobles and stuff like that. I think this was the one that it was, but I'm not sure. But yeah, so like then they ended up rebelling once they got here. But no, yeah, that the whole thing about rebellion was going back from like day one, you know what I'm saying? Even here in America, like in 1500s, it was like around like Georgia or Florida area, something like that. It was like all one big area, So, but yeah, I talk about this all day. I ain't gonna talk your head off about this stuff.
You can talk our heads off about this stuff. That's all right. You are perfectly all right. I know I'm in your bag. But we need to know that we resisted. We need to know that we have a long history of not accepting the unacceptable. We need to know that we came together and they continue to codify aspects of our life and our existence to this very day, that we are over policed, and that is one of the vestiges of slavery hanging over our heads, because they are trying to continue to keep us in our quote unquote place. So yeah, you can be in your bag. It's okay.
No, all facts, and that's the reason why they don't want to hear it, because they want to get rid of it as fast as possible. That's why a lot of, according to like all of those sources and stuff, like they wanted to get rid of the Nat Turner thing as fast as possible, and it was also illegal to document that kind of stuff. You know what I'm saying? Because that would lead other people. They just didn't want you to get any bright ideas. Like that's America's. Their biggest fear is for that you will wake up one day and realize, why in the hell am I letting this weak fool like do this to me, and that we are going to do to them what they have done to us. That's their biggest fear. They don't want us to know the truth.
You are absolutely correct. One of the things, I think that one of the reasons that they continue to try to hide the ball is because they realize that at the point that we recognize they can die too, at the point that we really all decide to crash out, like it's either give us our freedom or we gonna die together. At the point that we make the decision that, listen, it's not about this peaceful transfer of power, because that's never going to happen. You're never going to leave us alone. We can build stuff on our own, and we can build stuff on our own, but you're going to come and destroy it because you're jealous of us. They are fascinated with us, and some of us are unfortunately fascinated with them, but enough of us are not, to the point where we could start our own situation. We could start our own community, and we could monitor our community, as long as it wasn't as nice as the white folks community, as long as it was worse than or a step down from theirs, as long as it was less than. And we would have to keep poor white folks out of that community, because at the point that they see us living good, being okay, they begin to get jealous. And they begin to feel like, how is it that these Black people are living so good and I'm not? That is the story of every Black town that burned. Black people was doing good. Some poor white people got a glimpse. They got jealous and they came and destroyed it all. And they're afraid that we are going to get to the point where we begin to retaliate against them the way that they have retaliated against us, that we begin to destroy their homes, that we begin to kill their men, that we begin to codify their existence and make certain things that they do illegal, you know? And we're not even those types of people. That's not even who we are. We have changed epigenetically through this experience, but we have not lost our humanity. We just want to be left alone, but that doesn't mean that we can't get to the point where we recognize that, no, this has to stop, and we have to get to the point where we are doing some self-preservation and protectionism when it comes to our people. So we have to get to the point like some of those other enslaved men that were willing to crash out and kill slave owners, crash out and kill overseers, crash out and kill slave drivers, because that's where we are. We have to get to that point again so that we're not just being and seen as these docile people that you can just turn on some shaky booty music, give us a blunt, give us some liquor, pacify us with these consumable goods instead of the real tangible things that we need so that we can be free and liberated mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally.
No, yeah, that's all facts, and it's to keep you in that cycle, and like everything that you're saying is just like facts. And yeah, I forgot what I was gonna say because you said something just now. But yeah, even a lot of the rebellions or like when they attacked us and stuff like that, like I remember watching one movie and they was like a pool table. He was like, yo, this N-word got a pool table and I don't, you know what I'm saying? Like, and that was like economic warfare, which is like why I'll be talking about Ida B. Wells, because she said this. She was like one of the first people to say this. It's not about necessarily protecting white girls or whatever. It's about economic warfare, you know what I'm saying? And it's to make sure that you are dependent because they need you to be the worker class. Because like you were saying before, they tried to have their own quote unquote indentured servants, but they can't even go to the beach right now on a nice day without like putting cream on their skin. So it wasn't working, And one thing I wanted to say about like the 19, I think they used 1619 because like that's the British. Like the British is when they really got established around that time, like of course, they'd be like the Mayflower, but that's different because that's the Pilgrims. That was the criminals and stuff like that. Even though they all criminals, so that's neither here nor there. But I think they use that. But like the 1600s is like tricky because like a lot of people, especially like groups like the Moors and people who be like, yo, race is just the concept that they came up with and all of that. Like they like to use the rebellions from the 1600s. You mentioned that dude Birkenhead, the 1663 rebellion.
Yes,
you're talking about a white dude named John Birkenhead or something like that. He was an indentured servant. He was the one that snitched or whatever, but they like to say, oh yeah, well, white people and black people got together and all of this stuff, but they don't tell you like the real truth though. Like before any of that, the year before that, 1662, that's when they passed the law about, what was that law? I forgot, about black women.
The paternity of the status of the child follows the mother.
Right. Yeah. And that was the year before that. And before that, right, because the Pilgrims was really separated in the north of Massachusetts, and they was the first one to legalize selling children in 1640s, and like, yo, there's a whole thing like with they'd be like, oh, the first slave owner was a black man. Well, that's not even true. I ain't gonna even go to that point, but Anyway, yo.
I heard that point. You okay?
Yeah, because like it was like Anthony Johnson, but he wasn't even that wasn't even the first case to begin with. You know what I'm
No,
saying?
it wasn't. That's just one that they picked out.
Mhm.
They cherry pick these stories to try to tell us because we will popularize those stories and we will make them urban legends and folk tales in our community. But that's not true. It's like Sister Ross says, it seems like our humanity could be a curse to us because they take our humanity and we use it to all but ourselves. And she wants us to understand that. But the reality of the situation is like with the Anthony Johnson rumor, that was just one case that they highlighted because it was black on black and they could prove that it was black on black to say that, oh no, you do this to yourselves. Just like when they say we were sold by our brethren and our kindred. Well, yeah, that has some truth to it, but largely these were trades done for consumable goods from people that didn't have a concept as to what was actually going on and what was happening in the transatlantic slave trade. I don't know if they would have sold us if they had known how cruel this white man could be.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, because they leave out the fact when most of them found out, they was like, all right, yeah, we not doing. You're gonna have to stop because they was actually kidnapping the people who was because when they say they sell them, they was kidnapping the people that was selling the people. You know what I'm saying? Like they was taking everybody. So like, but and even with the dude Anthony Johnson, what they leave out is by the time he died, like 10 years later, like things had become so racist, he had to leave Virginia and go up to Maryland. And then they took all of his property because he was black. And then they took like gave his land to his son or something like that. And then they took the land from him and gave it to a white person, pretty much. You know what I'm saying? So they leave all of that part out. But the last thing I wanted to say is like was because you was talking about the good white dude and like the rebellions. You heard about like the Bacon's Rebellion, right?
Yes.
And a lot of people, especially like the Moors and stuff, they try to use that to try to prove that race isn't like a thing because these good white people. But
no such thing.
There's no such thing. Like Bacon was the original. What's his name? John Brown.
John Brown.
He was the original John Brown, right? Because he was a rich white dude who came over here, right, and got mad because they wouldn't let him into the council. And so he stirred up everybody to go attack the town or whatever. I think he died of like diarrhea or something like that, you know. And then they like, oh, that's when they separated race, but they leave out the whole story about 100. It was 100 years before this. They was talking about race, but they always say that like he was some good white dude trying to save people when really he was trying to use like our struggle so he could become the leader and the governor himself. You know what I'm saying? That's like the same thing with John Brown because we think that these white liberals somehow have our back or something. But like the good slave owner, like that's crazy to me, you know?
Yeah, that's crazy to me too. But you know, it's just like the Haitians who would let the Polish people into Haitian society because these were the good whites. And unfortunately, we have this humanist attitude towards others. And we feel that we are able to see the good in people and that we can somehow balance out the evil that their brethren do and separate them, when in fact it's more like the Muhammad Ali statement that says if it's 100 snakes coming at me and some of them are poisonous but 4 little garden snakes might be in there, I am not going to let all the snakes in because 4 of them are garden snakes that can't harm me. I'm gonna close the door on all the snakes. I'm gonna chop off all the heads of the snakes. And we have to get to the point where we see them as who and what they actually are, which are our enemy. They are our historic enemy. They are our natural enemy. And they recognize that they have always been our enemy. And they try to hide these stories because they don't want us to know that we are powerful when we're together, even though we were enslaved. We are powerful now if we come together, even though we are under their oppression. We are powerful if we come together and organize, even though they may be better armed. We have the ability to change this whole situation if we just decide to make up in our minds that we are not going to take this anymore and we stand up to them because they are ultimately cowards. It takes 4 of them to take out one of us.
Yeah, all facts to this very day, it still do, you know. And that's why they don't. It's still a gang to have 3 or more black people together. They still call us a gang, you know. And so,
Yeah, they still call us a gang, and we are over policed for that very reason, because they're worried about us coming together and conspiring to do something against them. And just because the cop is black doesn't mean that they see us any differently, because effectively there are certain positions that once a black person reaches that position, they are effectively a white person, and police officers are one of those jobs.
yeah, facts. And the patty rollers, you was reading about that the other day or yesterday.
Right.
Yeah, the patty rollers coming, you know. And you know, there's an audio of that song, right, from like the 1910s, like with this white dude singing that.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, yeah. Oh yeah, last thing too, like Sundays too. That most rebellions did take place on Sundays or like holidays, like 4th of July or Christmas, because that's when white people had their guard down on Sunday morning in church. Is when they had their guards down the most, and so that's usually when they plan to strike. You know, if somebody didn't like snitch or something, you know, and so like they just caught them slipping, like, and that's like a big part of this, a part of it, like why they would attack them on Sundays, and then they passed a law where like a white dude had to be in a church with them, and any gathering, even if it's a funeral, they had to be in there. So. Yeah.
Because they knew that we would talk about rebellion, because every man wants freedom and liberty. Each and every one of us. It's not unique for people to want to not be oppressed. It's not unique for people to want to be able to have freedom and autonomy over their own body. But they continue to think that if they divide or separate out the more intelligent of us from the less educated ones of us, that they will be able to re-enslave us. That's really what I believe. I really, really believe that. And they continue to try to divide out those that know from those that don't know, because those that don't know will see what's happening, but they don't know enough history to contextualize what's happening, like what's happening right now.
Yeah, all fact. And the only thing I'll say to that is they don't have to re-enslave us, like you were saying in the 13th Amendment. We already there and don't even know it. So that's all facts what you're saying, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I appreciate you letting me jump on here and speak. You know, this is my lane. I'd be going crazy on here talking all day about this topic. I love this topic. I appreciate you reading this. So
well, I appreciate you for coming up. I value your input. I know you are a wizard at all of this type of stuff, and I bow to the knowledge that you have. I take my hat off to you and nod my head, because I know that you know. You know, these are some stories, but I know that you know. And they're just little things that we just need to get right in the retelling of these stories, so that we can better understand what's going on, and so that we can better understand how to act and react to what's happening. You know, they're waiting for us to pop off and jump off and things like that, so they can instill martial law. They're waiting for us to respond and react, so that they can go crazy. And for people that voted for Trump, that thought that that was a way to alleviate some of the pain and oppression that they were going through, whether it was social or economic, you were wrong. And we told you that you were wrong, but you didn't listen.
yeah, facts. But yeah, I appreciate you, Matron. Shouts out to you, and thanks for letting me speak. And peace, everybody.
All right, peace. Sister Ross says their greatest fear is the unity of us as a people, and she sees it. I want to thank Forecast for being here, John Henry for being here, Sister Raw and the elders that listen with her for being here. I know that Anthony McPhail is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. I know that Oni Tase from the Pro-Black Perspective is listening, and so many others, including Bawana Haguziki and Justin Liebert. I value you. I value your input, and I value your thoughts and your support. I thank you for coming to listen to me. Tomorrow night, we're going to reread their retelling of Gabriel's Rebellion at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be back then. And until then, peace, guys.